Hi, this is Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri, in these United States. I will bring on Black Horse from, crucially for today's topic, Canada, in just a moment. But wanted to say that I'm very excited that this is a addendum, addition, I don't know how you want to look at it, certainly addressing something I had glossed over in the left-wing terrorism series. The left-wing terrorism series ranged pretty widely through history, starting 500 years ago, also covering some things that happened in the mid-century or early 20th century. But in particular, we focused on the book Days of Rage, which talked about terrorism in the 1960s and 70s and even into the 80s, in fact. And a group that kept coming in and out of the story was the FLQ, terrorists in Quebec, and I didn't really have the good context for it, and so I don't remember even how much I mentioned it when we went through that series. Probably here and there, but didn't really give it its due, and it was a pretty big deal, especially in Canada, as we are about to discover. If you would like to support the show, I we receive support through Subscribestar. If you go to the YouTube video link, you'll find the Subscribestar link. And most people give $5 a month, cheap, but it adds up and helps me cover the costs of my little hobby here. All right. Welcome, Black Horse.
How are you?
Doing well. And there's another purpose to this besides filling in a bit of the left wing terror series, and that is I thought it was maybe the most substantive way to promote your new project because this is really inspired by what you just started there. So if you could talk about that, and I guess what is the link that I should be finding and sharing while you talk? The Substack
Uh,
Red
I just
Ensign
put
link?
the
Or,
yeah, I just put the link to. So I let me talk about the project. So I have a
yeah.
project on the go, the Red Ensign Substack and podcast. Um, so I've written at the Red Ensign Substack for a significant period of time, but just kind of here and there when I found the time to do it. Given the current context in Canada, um, myself and a few of my friends, particularly cryptos, suggested that we should really put together a podcast to address Canadian politics a little bit more seriously. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're going to try to publish every other week there a podcast. And I like to do companion articles when I do a well researched podcast, um, because very often I've got lots of research that doesn't all quite make the cut, and so I will dump an article along with the podcast video. So the link there is or contains both the article and the video that I did uh, as a brief introduction to Canadian history to bring new listeners up to speed for the context for the discussions we're going to have.
Right, and so a thread that jumped out to me in that, partially because it fits to some degree with a show I recently did with someone here in Missouri on the French down in the Mississippi area. Um, in your history, you talk about the French that are up in the St. Lawrence River access area or whatever, and that at one point these were sort of similar and kind of working in tandem, and then their trajectory went very differently. We told the story of how the French in Missouri were eventually basically, they didn't go away, but they were just overwhelmed with massive Anglo immigration after the Louisiana Purchase. But it went quite differently for the French up north, right?
Yeah, so French can well, uh, New France, as it was then called, was organized
Yeah.
into three colonies: Acadia, Canada, and Louisiana.
Okay.
And uh, Canada was the largest of these colonies by a significant margin, and it had its capital at Fort Quebec, which is a critical strategic choke point on the St. Lawrence River Valley. During the Seven Years' War in 1750, British sent a fleet and with something like 17,000 men and captured the fort at Quebec, as well as several of the surrounding forts. And in the peace negotiation, uh, the an agreement was made uh, to cede Quebec, to cede Acadia to Canada, and Louisiana would remain a French possession. But
I'm sorry, what was Acadia? I'm picturing the other two. Louisiana is the one we were talking about, basically, before, and then
yeah, Louisiana
Quebec.
is the
But what's
Mississippi
Acadia?
River. Acadia is north of New England, in the on the New England Sound.
Okay, so this is east of Quebec.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay.
So that is the kind of the sea-facing land, just immediately north of the U.S. border was Acadia, and
Okay.
it was a fairly sparsely populated region at the time.
Right, and I don't know that we're going to really follow that story. So just real quick, does Acadia remain significantly French today?
Acadia is maybe 30% French,
Okay.
70% English speaking today.
Okay. Got it.
So, anyways, what happens here? The British conquer the colony. They get a bunch of land, much of which is now in the United States. Um, they impose a British colonial government, but there's no significant immigration immediately, and the colonial government sits over top a kind of Catholic clerical class that administers the colony. Uh, the Americans are quite unhappy with the arrangement that exists with French Canada. It's actually the Quebec Act, which defines the colony, is actually enumerated as one of the grievances in the Declaration of Independence.
I forgot about that. Okay.
And so, because it restricted settlement of the South Great Lakes region. Um, and so the American Revolution happens. The Americans invade French Canada, expecting the French Canadians to rise up against their British oppressors. They don't. And the Americans fail in the first of their several attempts to invade Canada. Um, and as part of the settlement in 1780 of the American Revolution, a large number of loyalists who had their land confiscated, etc., treated very poorly in the United States, were resettled by the British Crown in Acadia, so one of the French Canadian places, but also in Upper Canada. So rather than settling the loyalists in Quebec, in the area inhabited by French Canadians, they bought land from Native American tribes that was largely uninhabited, and English Canada is founded as a distinct region. Um, and so you end up with two separate but related colonial governments in Upper and Lower Canada, and that dynamic kind of forms and that's kind of the settlement dynamic. But the
Wait, I just wanted to
administration,
pause real quick. Something I had asked you to clarify for me because I found it a little confusing listening to your audio version. Uh, I was quite interested when the English presence became significant. There was English domination as of 1763 or whatever, right? But this was essentially a thin veneer of English overlords over a French population.
yeah.
Is
So
that right?
there's never English mass migration to Quebec ever, even to today.
Right, but I'm
So
sorry. I mean, Anglo Canada doesn't really have like a population of English speaking people in 1763, if I understand your story correctly. There's actually
that's correct.
there's colonial overlords, but there's not masses of English speaking people out there, right?
That's correct. There's
Yeah, yeah,
almost zero English speaking people at that
yeah,
time.
and that really begins a buildup of an English population. Really begins with the Loyalists fleeing after the or I guess during and after uh, the War of Independence from Britain in the
Yeah,
colonies. Yeah.
it really begins with so the War of Independence mostly wraps up, but the English hold on to New York City, Manhattan, and Long Island for quite a while. I think
Mm-hmm.
1781 or 1782, and
Mm-hmm.
they have this huge population of loyalists that are staying there after having fled all other places in the
The other
country,
colonies. Yeah. Yeah.
and they make eventually the British Crown makes a settlement with the American government, and the Americans enter New York, and the Loyalists are resettled. And this is a big question in British politics: what do we do with these people? And the
Mhm.
solution that they come to is, well, we'll buy them some land in what was then called the colony of Quebec.
Okay, so there's basically refugees from the other colonies who are loyalists who have ended up in Manhattan or whatever, and then the war's over. There's a settlement, and they don't, or New York's taken or whatever, and they don't get like slaughtered. They just get
Yeah,
relocated, right?
that's right. So they get
Okay,
relocated into Upper Canada and into Acadia, but even in even from 1790 forward, they don't actually settle in French Canada,
right,
right?
right,
What is now the province of Quebec continues to have this dynamic where there's a very thin layer of English aristocrats uh, dominating a vast population of French Canadians. Or,
right. And you
of,
you made a editorial comment that I thought was worth repeating, which is that, imagine that there was this population of English speaking people, and instead of sending them into the middle of the French speaking area that had its own culture and religion and so forth, they had them go settle somewhere else. Right.
yeah, exactly.
So imagine that method of dealing with an immigration issue. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah, so you get this situation for what is termed in French Canada something like the Dark Century, um, where you have this very thin elite class of Anglo Canadians that dominate French Canada um, in terms of its economic life, and to some extent in terms of its political life. Um,
And
and the situation,
they're referring to effectively the 19th century,
yeah, they're looking
more or
at
less.
the long 19th century
Yeah, long 19th
from
century.
sort of from roughly 1800 all the way through to the post-war period. Um, they're really referring
Oh,
to
post
in
World War
this.
II. That's a really long.
Yes, so
That's a really
it's
long
a
19th
really
century.
long 19th century. Uh, it's the only people who refer to this period as one period are French Canadians, because everyone else goes through radical political changes in this period. But French Canada is remember, French Canada becomes isolated from France before the French Revolution, um, and it stays isolated from uh, the politics of the outside world, uh, basically continuously until the post-war period. Um, so if you were under Duplessis' provincial government in 1950 in Quebec, you still had all of your social institutions were still dominated by the Catholic Church, the way that they were in Royalist France in 1710. And you still had like a formal government that sat on top of that, um, in organized as if it was kind of a military government, right? So the government situation in Quebec was essentially unchanged from the kind of pre French Revolution France for that entire period.
Right. Now, one thing probably to note, I don't know where it fits in, but as I think you've highlighted, uh, there was something going on during that time in the French-speaking area there, even though, the political dynamic didn't change, the political arrangement. And that is that they reproduced, right? That's probably worth noting.
Yes.
Because there was
Yes.
not a stream of, unlike the colonies, the colonies reproduced pretty well as well, but there was a lot of immigration into the colonies and later the United States. My understanding is there was very little initial immigration, which went to essentially zero into the French Canadian area, right? And yet
Yeah.
they had a large population.
Yeah. The estimated TFR in the intervening period is something like 9.2, which is
Whoa,
just
come on.
uh,
That sounds
it's
impossible.
Yeah, so it's not clear whether there's some failure of census data in the late
Yeah,
18th
this
century.
is like they're going from house to house, and they're like, "Are you pregnant? Why aren't you pregnant?" You know.
Yeah. Well,
This is
this has
what
always
we
been
Jordan Peterson talked about enforced monogamy. This is enforced, fertility, something like that, right?
well in Quebec they have a term for it. Translates to revenge of the cradle, and
Uh huh.
there's a very kind of intentional strategy going on in this period to try to overwhelm the English speaking population.
Got it. Okay.
Um,
So it has
but
got a political angle to it. It isn't just spontaneous order.
yeah,
They think it's a good idea for their community to become numerous,
yes,
right?
yeah, that's one way to put it. And this is a
Revenge of
long
the cradle.
like a stereotype of French Canada from English Canada is to
Hmm.
think of them as like, you know, the way a kind of 90s New York liberal would think of you having seven, you have 8 children.
Hey,
Yeah,
yeah,
having 8 children as a
yeah.
sign of your like low education and low
Right,
social
right.
status.
Yep.
The same kind of dynamic exists between English and French Canada all through, really beginning in the mid 19th century. It starts to be thought of that way.
Right. But some of that significant growth that we looked at was actually going back into the 1700s. Right.
Yeah, this
Yeah.
goes back a long way.
Yeah. And anyway, they were successful. Maybe someone should take. There's all these people talking about pronatalism and what policies work and stuff. Maybe they should be studying Quebec.
Yeah.
Seems like they
Well,
succeeded.
yeah, all the more interesting because after the events we're going to talk about, TFR collapsed in Quebec, and Quebec is now one of the least fertile places in the Western world.
Interesting. Okay. Anyway,
Um,
try not to get too drawn into the TFR rabbit hole on that one, but that is an
yeah, yeah.
interesting story. Okay. Okay. So you're
So
getting us up to the point of well, okay. We're jumping ahead too far because we're going to hit World War One at some point.
yeah, so we have this situation going on, and uh, the French Canadians conceptualize this. If you imagine a caricature of the way a white nationalist thinks of the American government as dominated by a certain ethnic minority, that's the way that French Canadians interpret their situation.
Yeah.
Um, so they, even though like if you look historically, it's not really. Um, English Canadians are substantially overrepresented in government and in business, but they're not. It's not like there are no French Canadian elites in this period. Um, but it would be just like pointing out to an American white nationalist that there are, I don't know, WASPs that work at the State Department or something. Like
Hmm.
they have a certain interpretation of the dynamics, and this, as long as goes through the Canada goes through this long period between 1812 and 1914 where there's peace, there are regular people don't pay any taxes, and there's very little interaction with the state at all. And so as long as that continues, this kind of doesn't come up. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
I'm reminded of hearing stories of the 18th and 19th century in the colonies in the U.S. and it's hard for us to understand just how little like national politics meant to almost everyone's lives. The governments were not large. They didn't have much to do with your life. Like in our case, we got the mailman was technically an employee of the federal government, but you know that didn't like mean that you were worried the mailman was gonna be spying on you for the feds or something. You know what I mean? It just was
yeah,
an irrelevancy to your life. And so, yeah, I mean, this is partially just the era. It's not an era of big government, big intrusive government, right?
but that all changes very, very rapidly in Canada as a result of the First World War. Um,
Gotcha.
so, as a result of the First World War, the Canadian government introduces income taxes. They spend upwards of 70% of the national budget on uh, military spending. And in 1917, they introduced the Conscription Act. So, uh,
Should we,
Go ahead.
we hadn't done those first two pictures. Should we slip those in real
Yeah,
quick before we hit World War One?
yeah,
Pull
sure.
that up. Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Why does it say speak white? What is this talking about?
So, just as certain people would characterize the Irish as not white,
Mm-hmm.
um, there is a very similar kind of dynamic between Anglo-Canadian business owners in Quebec and their French-Canadian workforce. And so they had a euphemism for speaking English rather than speaking French. Um, so
Speak white
this
meant to
became
speak English.
exactly.
Really? They
Uh,
actually used that phrase back then.
yes.
That is very interesting. Okay.
Yeah. Well, remember, this is the British Empire, which is kind of explicitly an ethnic supremacist project for the Anglo-Saxon.
Right.
So it's a very different world than we presently occupy.
I mean, I
And
remember Sargon joking about, are the Greeks even white? But I wouldn't have thought that about like the French or whatever. But anyway, it's all context, right?
yeah, in Canada at that time, there's a very like all the same things that Americans in the 1850s were saying about the Irish were all
Mm-hmm.
being said by Anglo Canadians about the French Canadians, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Gotcha.
And the resentment went both ways.
Right.
So in this period, you have like English Canadians are something like 1 or 2% of the population in Quebec, and they represent like 40 or 50% of the wealth, something like that,
Yeah. Right.
uh,
Right.
to kind
Gotcha.
of see the picture. So if we
Mm-hmm.
fast forward to our next picture is of the conscription crisis.
Right.
So in 1917, um, so Canada doesn't have a problem initially recruiting for World War One. There's a huge wave of overwhelmingly English Canadian volunteers, but the war drags on. A lot of Canadians die, and there's conscription in every other country in the Anglo world. And so the Borden government decides they want to bring in conscription, which goes down broadly speaking. Anglo Canada is very in favor of conscription
Mm-hmm.
because uh, the overwhelming majority of eligible age Anglo Canadians have already volunteered.
Mm-hmm.
Um, whereas French Canada, um, the majority of eligible age French Canadians have not volunteered, and they view this as a war of the empire that's not their business, and all of the kind of resentment, the ethnic resentment of being ruled over by this thin crust of Anglo aristocrats, pours out in anti-conscription sentiment, and you
Mm.
get these very ugly anti-conscription riots. Um, so this is a picture of one of these riots in Quebec City.
It looks like a very orderly riot, but anyway.
Yeah, it's. I mean, Canadian riots are in this time period are very civilized. They have no garbage. There's no. Uh,
Right.
they're quite different than your modern American riot.
Right. Right. But it does say pas de conscription, which means
Yeah,
no
no,
conscription, right? Oh, and
that's right.
sorry, just um, France is in World War One on the same side, so why aren't they excited to go and fight because of France?
Well,
They don't seem to see this as, hey, we're going to go and fight alongside France. They see this as, we're going to be fighting for the British Empire and we don't care about them, right?
exactly. That's the way they see it.
Yeah.
Um, the connection between France and French Canada is, I mean, it's stronger and weaker in different periods, but at
Hmm.
this time, they don't see themselves really as the same people exactly.
Got it. Okay, so there's a little bit of a ethnogenesis or something like that. A distinctive people had formed because, as I mentioned, there was almost no immigration from France. There was the initial immigration, right? That's how they started, but then
Yeah.
there was almost none for like 100 years or something, right? I mean, they
Yeah,
really did
from
just they just were their own little outpost, having developing their own culture. And I don't know this for sure, but I think my mom talked about this because she spoke French and had visited there. Um, the dialect, I think, is not something that
Yeah, it's
proper
quite
French
different.
proper French speakers are not going to be totally happy with it, right?
Yeah, the other thing that's a really big deal in this period is that French Canada in this period is extremely Catholic, and
Hmm.
they view the French Revolution as this disaster that's happened to the mother country, and the secular government of France is kind of illegitimate in a way, right?
I see. So French Canada is like a time capsule for pre-revolutionary France in certain respects. They remain
Yes.
Catholic, or at
Uh,
least up until, I guess we'll get there. But at this
yeah.
time, they still remain more the Catholic French as opposed to the French Revolutionary secularized French, right?
That's right.
Interesting.
And
Huh.
the events we're talking about right here, more than any other events in the history of Quebec, uh, begin the snowball that changes all of that.
Okay.
So in Quebec City on Easter weekend, in the middle of the night, British troops opened fire into a crowd of French Canadian protesters. Um, to this day, we don't know how many people died in this event. The official number is two. The unofficial number is many more than two.
Mm,
Uh, um, and the y- it it there's demonstrations across French Canada, but they're quelled quite violently,
yeah.
and their violent suppression is celebrated in English Canada.
Mm,
Um, and the war goes on to its conclusion. Lots of other things happen in Canadian politics, but this is remembered bitterly in French Canada forevermore. Um, and it inspires French Canadians of the following generation to develop radical anti-Anglo politics under kind of the permissible angle for radical politics at the time, which is left-wing politics.
so we were thinking mostly, I think, about the post World War II, or that's where we're going to head here. But is this really starting in the interwar period, even as far as you know?
Yeah, so
Okay.
uh,
Yeah. Yeah.
every union in this time that's striking in the 30s is also a French Canadian nationalist organization, basically.
Hmm.
Every strike has this dynamic. Um, the depression hits Canada like the depression hits the U.S. In the U.S., it's kind of uh, the depression carries with it this wave of socialism. In Canada, that's not the case really at all. We don't get any of the welfare state as a result of the depression.
Mm,
But what we do get is this um, never-ending parade of strikes and riots from French Canadian workers.
gotcha.
And the English Canadian government in the pre-war period is very worried about a communist revolution in Quebec. Um, Suddenly, after the war, they completely stopped being worried about a communist revolution in Quebec, and they permit radical left-wing culture to circulate under the surface.
Yeah. I'm sorry. After World War One, you're saying.
No, after World War II.
Okay.
So
After
in the
World War II, in the interwar period, they're worried about the left wing revolutionary fervor or whatever. After World War
yes,
II, for some reason, it's okay now because of the
well,
Burma
for
Truth
some reason,
regime or something like that. Yeah.
yeah. So they
Yeah.
they pass from the British Empire to the American Empire. In the British Empire, anti-communism is the order of the day, and like anti-leftism is the order of the day. And in the American Empire, leftism is winked and nodded at. You can't crack down on left-wing radicals, especially in the post-war period.
Hmm.
So you have, if we forward to our next slide here, you have a whole culture that develops of left-wing radicalism with a French Canadian tinge, all kind of published in French.
Hmm.
So there's a famous poem, "Speak White." There's a whole pile of books published. You get an intellectual vanguard, which is uh, highly leftist and highly and French Canadian nationalist, and they kind of It's very, very similar to the situation you see with Sinn Féin and the IRA in Ireland, where you
Hmm.
have an intellectual firmament that forks two ways, one into a legitimate political movement, and another into a set of terrorist organizations.
Yeah, underground. There's an underground,
Yes.
and then there's the official. I just wanted to comment, since I am adding this to the left wing terror series. Um, the title here, which you can all guess, I blocked it out to try to protect ourselves from YouTube. Um, Very interesting framing because it's on. I don't know if you'd have any idea if there's a reason they're doing it this way, but this framing fits very much the radicalism that we already discussed in Days of Rage, which is not well understood. It's often thought that the 60s American radicals were primarily about the opposing the Vietnam War. But when you actually dig into the Weather Underground and a number of the other groups we talked about that actually started bombing and killing, it actually had to do with Black liberation. And
Yep.
so this particular autobiography of a Quebec terrorist is saying, we are like the blacks in America. That's the parallel that's being drawn here, which makes
Yeah.
complete sense in the context of how left wing radicals are thinking at that time. It makes sense
Yeah.
to frame it this way. Whether you think that's a great parallel is another question, but it makes good
Well,
political sense to frame it this way.
and it's all like, if you think about the statements "speak white,"
Mm-hmm.
transfer for pure forward into this period, it slots in beautifully, right? So you have kind of this intellectual movement which is doing this really be the intellectual movement begins kind of immediately after the war, and it spawns these two uh, descendant movements, the kind of the official political movement. And if we move forward on our screen here, we'll get uh, oh
What do you want
maybe we
first?
should be um, I
Do you
want
want? Would you want Renee?
yeah, I want Rene Levesque for the official
Okay,
political
let's do that
movement.
first. Okay, so here's the face. Here's
Yeah,
the face they're putting forward in terms of official politics, right? And it's the
yeah.
what
So
did you
we
say,
got
the PQ? What does it stand for?
Parti
Party
Québécois,
Party Québécois. Okay, and they are
and
literally a officially registered political party in Canada, etc. Right?
well, not only an officially registered political party, they dominate the politics of the province from this period on,
And
right?
still do
So that
to this day.
and still do to this
Okay,
day.
gotcha.
And they're formed in 1968. So it takes a while to kind of organize this, but once they organize it, uh, they organize it and they win.
Hmm. Yeah.
So they have a lot of formal political success because they've got this big kind of populist backing. And Rene Levesque is a uniquely gifted um, politician
Mm.
as well. They have their vanguard in official politics is quite strong,
Hmm.
much stronger than their comps in, say, the Irish radical left or uh, other liberation movements at this time.
This is quite odd for me as an American, and even thinking about the UK and so forth. Well, okay, actually there is a parallel in the UK, but anyway, in the US we have the Republicans and the Democrats, and really no other party tends to really matter that much, right?
Yeah,
At the national level. Um, Similarly, in Canada, you have liberals and conservatives, right? But there's this other party that is a significant player, right? They're not
yeah.
an
So
equal player, I assume, but they're up there. They're not a 1% of the
yeah,
vote nationally kind of player.
yeah. Very frequently, they're the third largest party in parliament. At various times, they've held the balance of power in minority governments.
Hmm.
So, and I should clarify, at the federal level, it's the Bloc Québécois. The Parti Québécois is the provincial version of it. So
Oh, okay.
In Quebec nationalist thinking, the premier of Quebec is a more important position than representation in the federal government, because
Gotcha. Yeah.
the underlying assumption is that one day they'll separate from the federal government and
Right.
the federal government won't matter anymore. And so
Yeah.
the Bloc Québécois sits there exclusively to extract patronage from the Canadian federal government.
Right. But they see the premier as essentially the proto-president or proto-prime minister of their country, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so the stars of Quebec politics are always the provincial political leaders, not the leaders of the Bloc Québécois.
Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Anyway, just parallel world, trying to imagine that. What I was going to say is I was saying that UK is not like that, but they have the Scottish Nationalist Party.
Yeah. So imagine if the Scottish Nationalist Party was actually Scottish nationalist.
Right. Yeah.
And you'll get the you'll get something like the Parti Québécois.
Right. Right. Which it sounds like by what you're saying there, just to finish on the PQ here, unlike the Scottish nationalists, they have really stuck to their guns about what they're about and not just become flavor of the month left-wing party. They still retain that core separatist thing, right?
Yeah, they're an ethno-nationalist party with left-wing
Right.
characteristics.
But the core is ethno-nationalist. Yeah, yeah.
That's right.
Gotcha.
And that's a big distinction between not only like down to their bones they're that way, whereas Sinn Féin and the Scottish
SNP.
Nationalist Party, when they got power, immediately they were globalists.
Right.
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 They put Humza Yousaf in the as the head of the Scottish Nationalist Party. That's not happening to the Parti Québécois. It just isn't.
Yeah. Right. Gotcha. Okay. Anyway, thank you for comparing the PQ. That's very interesting. Okay. Anyway, so this is the official face, and we're not going to focus that much on this. Just acknowledging that there's an interplay as usual between the underground and the official party of some sort.
That's
right.
That's right. And then the unofficial vanguard is the FLQ, Front de Liberation Quebec.
Yeah.
If you can excuse my terrible accent.
Mm-hmm.
So if we move over to them, they have a different idea for how to advance Quebec nationalist politics. And so in the period beginning in about 1962, they engage in something like 200 bombings of various targets, and the targets are symbolic of this kind of Anglo crust that sits over top of French Canadian society. So they target the mayor of Montreal, they target the Montreal Stock Exchange, any site that smacks of the economic or political elite that they see as oppressing them is considered a legitimate target for FLQ activity.
Yeah, and I just have to, because it tends to get forgotten these days, especially if you're not a leftist and didn't grow up in a leftist family. There's this phrase, propaganda of the deed, which was very big back then, and it means this kind of stuff. It means that, sure, you hand out your pamphlets, but you also advance your cause by blowing stuff up, kidnapping people, killing people. That's part of your propaganda, right? That's how they think in these days.
And in this period, they kill 7 people in kind of there's 160 bombs they plant, and they only kill 7 people. So they're not targeted to be mass casualty events.
Mm-hmm.
They're targeted to be symbolic events.
Right.
Very similar to the way the Weather Underground targeted like banks and
right.
Symbols of what they saw as the capitalist system.
Yeah,
but with
and
this kind of
they usually the Weather Underground, I think, usually felt bad if someone got hurt, but because they didn't really want to do that. I gather that the FLQ wasn't so bothered when somebody got hurt. It didn't stop them.
Well, kind of like the IRA, because there's this ethnic component, as long as the people you hurt were English Canadians, it was okay,
Gotcha.
right? Or part of the oppressive capitalist state or some other nonsense, right?
Right.
So this all comes to a head when in 1970, on October the 5th, one of the cells of the FLQ gets the bright idea to kidnap the British Trade Commissioner James Cross. So the British Trade Commissioner is a member of the Canadian government, part of the cabinet of the federal government. So imagine, I don't know, you kidnapped Pete Hegseth in the U.S. right now. That's
Right.
kind of a comparable, or kidnapped RFK. And
Right. And I'm sorry,
they
it's slightly confusing because the title, this is not someone who's British. This is someone who's Anglo-Canadian.
yes.
Right. Yeah. It's just their role has to do with trade or something.
Yeah, it has to do with the trade with the British Empire, or
Right.
at this
Gotcha.
point, British Commonwealth.
Mm-hmm.
And so the FLQ, as part of, sends a note demanding the release of 23 prisoners, 500,000 in gold, broadcast of the FLQ manifesto, and an airplane to take them to Cuba or Algeria.
Mm-hmm.
So there's propaganda of the deed here. They want some, and then there's kind of, they want to featherbed their escape. So they want to make a big splash. They want to get their friends out of jail, and then they want like a plan to featherbed themselves in some jurisdiction where they don't think that they can be arrested.
And these are demands for the return of and what would be gotten in return is James Cross being given back. Right.
That's right.
Yeah. And
So
how do they do on their demands?
so Trudeau and then Premier Bourassa say that they're not going to cave to any of these demands. We don't negotiate with terrorists, all that kind of stuff. They assign somebody to negotiate, but as those negotiations continue to do badly, well, so first the terrorists actually get something they want. So the FLQ manifesto is read first on French Canadian radio, and then on CBC radio, and then on Radio Canada, which is the French Canadians version of CBC. So they get one of the things that they want right out of the gate within a couple of days. Whether that is as a result of French Canadian sympathy in that organization, or whether that's a result of a concession in the negotiation, we still don't actually know.
Oh, really?
But it goes on. A letter is delivered to Premier Bourassa, the Premier of Quebec, who decides to read it as part of a public speech. They read a letter of him pleading for his life. And immediately after this all goes on, the FLQ kidnap another member of government, in this case, the Quebec Minister of Labor, Pierre Laporte. So on October 10th, they kidnap Pierre Laporte, and it's actually Laporte's letter that Bourassa reads the next day as part of his speech.
And this is
so it's
1970 we're talking about, right?
This is 1970.
Okay.
And so it's unclear the extent to which the Bourassa government is exactly which side they're on, whether there are sympathies for the FLQ in that government. But there's a lot of politicking going on at that time. The next day, on October 12th, so Laporte is kidnapped on the 10th. On the 11th, it's announced, and Bourassa reads this letter pleading for his life. And on the 12th, the Canadian Army is sent to Quebec. The War Measures Act is invoked. For those who aren't familiar with the Canadian political system, the War Measures Act is a part of the Canadian Constitution at this time, recently renamed the Emergencies Act and made famous during the truck protest during 2022. But it suspends all civil liberties in the country and essentially puts the sitting government into a Roman style dictatorship where they have the right to arrest anyone and everyone for whatever reason. And Trudeau Sr. Uses that power to deploy the army on every street corner in Quebec and to outlaw the FLQ.
Yeah, so I'm start to move through some of these images here. So FLQ outlawed. This is October 14th, 1970. Hundreds of people are arrested as suspected parts of FLQ.
Members of the FLQ. Yeah.
Right. And then a couple images here of military everywhere throughout Quebec City, I guess.
This is Montreal.
This is Montreal. Okay.
Yeah. So at this, Montreal is the largest city in Quebec at this time by quite a margin. So they deploy like hundreds of thousands of soldiers at the time. It's quite quite dramatic. The intent is to make the statement that there's a soldier on every street corner throughout French Canada.
Yeah.
So this goes on for quite a while. Laporte is kidnapped on October the 10th, and on October 17th, Laporte's body is found in the trunk of a car in Saint Hubert in Quebec. So we don't know exactly how he died, but he's murdered by his kidnappers in some ways. But they still have Cross, who was kidnapped even before Laporte. So they kill one of the hostages immediately after the Emergencies Act. So on October 16th, the War Measures Act is announced from Parliament, and this is after the troops are deployed. The next day, Laporte is found dead. So it's a statement killing intended to say, you will not intimidate us, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But neither side backs down, and the troops remain deployed around Quebec for like a month. So on
shall I do the death of
yeah, so there's so we've got Laporte. His funeral is a huge deal, broadcast throughout Quebec, full military honors, all this stuff.
And this actually matters, his murder and the perception of it, because I don't think you'd highlight it. The FLQ actually has like students supporting it, and it has to some degree some popular support until they kill this guy, and that seems to change the perception of the FLQ quite a lot, right?
Yeah, I mean, the FLQ continues to have popular support afterwards, but it's the Trudeau government makes a big show of Laporte's funeral to try to get French Canada on side with the War Measures Act and on side with the crackdown on the FLQ. So when you look through these images, what you're looking at is a propaganda campaign from 1970 to try to convince the population that the FLQ are evil and try to kind of marginalize them politically. That propaganda campaign is not especially successful.
Okay. I got the idea it had been quite successful. You're saying it really wasn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's somewhat so it is like the relationship becomes like the relationship between the Provo IRA in Northern Ireland and the broad population, where there's a mixture of fear and respect. So on the one hand, they're not considered a legitimate political vehicle. Their cause is considered legitimate. But also there's a feeling that maybe it's time we pass through official political channels rather than passing, like, there's not a perception that this is going to accomplish the political ends that the people want. But this goes on for a long time. So it takes until December 3rd for the police to discover where James Cross is being held.
Mm-hmm.
So remember, we started this journey back on October 7th, October 6th, and we're all the way down to December 4th. So almost 2 months between when he's kidnapped and when the police discover where he is.
And military law the whole time, right? Martial law the whole time.
Martial law the whole time,
Yeah.
incredibly visible military presence throughout the province. And rather than attempt to use the military and police to rescue Cross by force, they successfully negotiate with the FLQ cell that's holding him. And the FLQ members receive safe passage to Cuba, and they return Cross unharmed. And so we've got an image there of Cross returning to his family. But after 2 months in captivity, he loses some weight, but he says that he wasn't seriously mistreated.
Yeah, sorry, so going back to that. Yeah.
So the troops stay on the streets in Quebec for another 20 days until December the 24th, right before Christmas.
Okay.
So
and by the way, I just got to mention what a striking thing this is from the story I was telling about the left-wing terrorism throughout the late 60s, 70s, and so forth in the U.S. Because even though I was actually a child when it was happening, I did not remember hardly anything except that an heiress was kidnapped. And I remembered vaguely that that was like some kind of left-wing group that did that. And then I ended up covering them in the days of, they're covered in the Days of Rage. But generally, I would say that what happened back then has effectively disappeared, gone down the Orwellian memory hole. Whereas I gather that the events you're talking about probably haven't been forgotten yet. Certainly not in Quebec.
Oh, this was everywhere at the time. Like 9/11 level of coverage.
Yeah.
At the time.
Right.
And is a massive specter in particularly French Canadian politics today. In English Canada, it's kind of there have been other fights since then. It was briefly remembered when Trudeau the Younger invoked the War Measures Act for something that
we did that before.
Yeah. Childish.
Yeah.
But it in Quebec, it is still like a defining moment in something that every person that you meet there would know about.
Right. Yeah. So that's quite different because for me, reading the Days of Rage, going through that in the Left Wing Terror series was a weird experience. It was like, oh, all this stuff happened in my country and I was alive at the time. I didn't even know about like 99% of this, you know. It was very eye-opening to go through that for me. Whereas the history you just went through is probably going to be considered not detailed enough for Québécois, right?
Yeah, well, I already have some super chats here asking me to explain the inside-outside thing with official politics and the FLQ, because at the same time as there's this anti-Anglo thing going on, there's also competition between the different arms of Quebec nationalists. So the FLQ is a radical fringe that is kind of winked and nodded at by the Parti Québécois, but they're also rivals in a certain sense, because the Parti Québécois wants to be seen as legitimate, so they want to be distant from their radicals. So they take many opportunities to try to create some space there, but they also want to be seen as sufficiently radical to kind of gather that popular energy. And so there's a kind of dance going on there all throughout the 60s and 70s. And it's very, anyways, if you ask different people about this, you'll get different answers about exactly how aligned they are politically.
Right. Let me go ahead and read a little bit of what Truck Bro wrote here in 2 super chats. Thank you. Though I'm sure it's in good faith on Black Horse's part, the PQ is not the political party, the FLQ, which I guess we'd sort of implied by comparing it to the IRA and Sinn Féin.
Yeah, it's not quite like the IRA
like
and
that.
Sinn Féin. There's actual people that go back and forth between the IRA and Sinn Féin. It's much more like the Provo IRA and Sinn Féin after the Irish Republic existed, where it's not there's sympathy, but it's a line across which individuals who are part of the IRA, the Provos in the 80s, don't go back and forth into Irish government.
Right.
And not only that, the Irish government is kind of actively working to undermine them because they see them as competitors to be the leaders of Irish nationalism. And it's a very similar kind of relationship where the government at this time in Quebec is they're trying to find this balance between representing the interests of representing this kind of ethno-nationalist concern, not wanting to be associated with the communist left because that's an issue, and not wanting to be associated with terrorism, but also kind of winking and nodding at the goals of the terrorists. So it's it's
complicated.
The Truck Bro is correct that my initial telling of this story reflects, my grandfather was called up as a senior officer in the army to go and occupy Quebec. So it kind of informs the way that this is thought about in English Canada. Right?
Yeah. So one more comment from Truck Bro, clarification. Just to make the point that it is the nationalist PQ, UN, Duplessis who made Pierre Trudeau send in the army to stop the FLQ. So
yeah,
I guess so there's this story that we're telling of the 60s, right, of what's happening there. But then during this crisis and the kidnappings, it goes from winks and nods to, oh, wait a second. the official party has to suppress the underground, right?
Yeah, and it's kind of a lot of how that's remembered is very political. So the Trudeau government makes a big show of being invited by the government of Quebec to occupy it.
Right.
So there are big imagine if the Americans made a big show of having some official in Iraq tell them that they're being invited rather than invading. Right.
Yeah. Right.
It's that kind of relationship. But it's the question of the extent to which that invitation is legitimate versus coerced is a highly political question in Quebec even to this day.
Yeah. And we're not taking a position on that. Just fair to say, Truck Bro's right. It was done with at least the surface support of the PQ, for example, right?
Yes.
But it should be noted it's complicated, right?
Yeah, it should be noted that other narratives are available depending on your brand of French Canadian nationalism.
Yeah. Gotcha.
So this goes on. It's notable that the 5 members of the cell which kidnapped Laporte and Cross are actually released and sent to Cuba.
With the gold, right?
They get some money, but they don't get the full 500,000 in bullion.
Okay.
So they go to Cuba, and interestingly, as a group, they all decide they don't like it in Cuba after a certain period of time, and they move to France. And the French government immediately turns them over to Canadian authorities, and they all serve various terms in prison, ranging from 20 to 8 years.
Wow. So some are still in
Um,
prison, I guess, right?
well, 1970, 20 years, they're not in prison anymore.
Okay, I thought you said 20 to 80.
No, 8 to 20 years
8
is
to 20.
the
Oh, okay, okay. So they're
yeah.
all out now. Yeah.
Yes, they're all out. And a lot of the members of the FLQ uh, who were arrested in the campaign of mass arrests end up getting released. Um, and it's unclear, again, this is highly political, the extent to which these are actual members of a terrorist organization that are getting released uh, as part of a political endeavor versus the extent to which the army was just arresting anyone, and many of these people might not have been part of the FLQ.
I'm going to switch just because it's better to our thumbnail while you talk about this fellow, Paul Rose.
Yeah, so Paul Rose.
Explain. I like the image, and that's why I chose it for the thumbnail. But it's not a terrible image to use, right?
Yeah, so this is Paul Rose after the surrender of Cross. So Cross is turned over to the authorities. Paul Rose raises a Black Power fist um, on his way to the airplane to be depending on your perspective, either make his escape or be exiled to Cuba, depending on your perspective.
Right, right.
And so he and his co-conspirators go to Cuba, and they don't actually stay very long. Within a relatively short time, they they go to France and discover that the French authorities don't think that they're French nationalist heroes, and turn them over to the Canadian government.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha.
So the net of this, out of the 500 people that were arrested, 435 of them were released, and only 62 of them were actually charged with crimes. So it's hard to say whether this crackdown is like an overreaction and actually only 62 people had any involvement in terrorism, or whether some of those people are getting released because the political reaction by the Canadian establishment is conciliatory towards the FLQ rather than like, if you compare and contrast this to the reaction of the Canadian government to the anti-COVID protests, the reaction to the anti-COVID protests was to go on TV and say that there's no legitimate argument that these people have. That's not the reaction at all during the FLQ crisis. The reaction during the FLQ crisis is to say, yeah, Quebec nationalism is acceptable, but kidnapping MPs is not.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I just want to share a little bit from the Wikipedia article on the FLQ just to show how much they were, and I saw this in Days of Rage. There was communication and sort of mutual support between them and other left-wing terrorist groups at the time. So it says some of the members were organized and trained by, I don't know how to say that name, George Schoters, a Belgian revolutionary. Two of the members received, Normand Roy and Michael Lambert, received guerrilla training from the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization in Jordan.
Yeah.
And then I'm forgetting the details, but one of them ended up basically continuing to operate in the U.S. as a left-wing terrorist after all of this, I believe.
Yeah.
So yeah, they're trading knowledge and training and support back and forth with other left-wing groups. But what I found interesting, as distinct from, say, the Weather Underground, this is a group that has a cause that is quite old. You could say it started in 1763 from a certain point of view,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
With the English domination of the French in Canada. And I thought your point was quite astute, that had the temper of the time been different, they might have posed themselves as right wing, as long as the core of it was still the political liberation of the French from English domination, right? That seems to have really been the cause. The left wing in this case is a little bit of an afterthought, maybe. Let us suggest that. opinions could vary on this, right?
Yeah, and the one of the ways you can kind of tell that ethnic nationalism is the core rather than the periphery of what's going on here is that in the years since the FLQ crisis, French Canadian nationalists have have become a lot less radical left, right? So if you
Mm.
explore French Canadian nationalist circles today, you won't find very many communists anymore. You will find left-wing people, but you will not. They're not operating out of the communist tradition the way that, and like none of these people are reading the Weather Underground anymore,
Hmm. Right.
particularly.
Right.
Um,
Not relevant.
but
Yeah.
they still have this deep connection to the French Canadian nation going way, way back.
Um, okay. Did you have? I was gonna maybe grab a few other comments that I thought were interesting.
Yeah.
Besides the super chats from Truck Bro, did you have any other points you wanted to make about this story?
No.
Okay. A number of people noted on the Acadian point that that is where we get the term Cajun, which
Yep.
is a slight mangling of Acadian. These were Acadians who left and migrated to Louisiana. Why did they leave? I've never known that story. Why did they end up in Louisiana?
So inside the Quebec colony, there was no English Canadian settlement, but in Acadia, there was Loyalist settlement.
Right.
And the government they got in Acadia, or in Acadia, which then became a couple of different provinces in Canada, was not French Canadian Catholic. So
Mm-hmm.
many of these people at that time resettled to Louisiana, which was still part of France.
Oh, it happened way back then while it was still part of France. Okay.
Yes.
Gotcha. So
So they moved there when it was still part of France.
The Cajuns are uh, um, moving to Louisiana in the 1700s somewhere, right?
Yeah, between 1760 and like 18 before 1812, because the Louisiana Purchase is during the Napoleonic Wars.
Right. Um, okay, got it. I didn't realize quite how. Well, I just hadn't known the story. I just know Cajun culture from visiting New Orleans and stuff, but I didn't know the full story. Okay, who are the Nordique? Someone said bring back the Nordiques.
The
Nordiq.
the Nordiques are the Quebec City hockey team,
Oh, okay.
which went bankrupt and became the Colorado Avalanche. Very sad story.
Oh no. Okay.
Well, and not only that, they went bankrupt at a time they had a couple of just unbelievably talented players and went on to win the Stanley Cup immediately after leaving Quebec.
Jules Roy says French Canadians were loyal to the King of France. And believe it or not, French Canadians even liked the British monarchy up until about the 1950s, because I guess they were more sort of royalist inclined in their thinking.
Yeah, I don't. That might be a bit of a stretch. I don't
Okay.
know.
Okay.
I don't know enough about the social history of French Canada to know for sure that whether French Canadians liked or disliked the British monarchy in the period. They definitely were treated. They definitely weren't as anti-British monarchy as, say, the American settlers.
Gotcha. Right. Right. Jules Roy said I had to read this book at university in the 1990s. Okay. So one of the books of the
Yes,
yeah. Okay. So there you go.
I also had to read that book at university in
Oh, really?
significantly later than the 90s.
You did,
Yeah.
even
So
though
it's
you weren't.
still
Okay.
well, it's still so the racial angle on French Canadian nationalism,
Yeah.
I think after the events of 2020, it will be expunged from university curriculums.
Mm-hmm.
But before 2020, it was still like a real thing that people, like respectable people, believed. That book, which would have gotten Papa John canceled, is still sold on Amazon.
Yeah.
So it's if you have the leftist ant smell, you can still kind of get away with things.
Someone mentions the British speakers in Montreal live on the island in Montreal, so they basically have a moat around them.
Yes, there's
That's true.
yeah, not even just the island, like a very specific part of the island.
And that's where the Anglo elite that owned all this wealth tended to be.
Yes.
Okay.
Interestingly, that's where the Trudeau home was. Still, that's where Trudeau the Younger lives. So it's and there's a very prominent American politician who grew up there as well. I think it's oh shoot, I think it was Kamala Harris who grew up in that part of Montreal. Anyways, I don't know if that's true. I forget which American politician it was.
I'm not going to read out the exact details here, but it was brought up in the chat that JF Gary Epi, who's sort of in right-wing circles, is French Canadian. So
yeah,
I'll stop with
that. It was in fact Kamala Harris who lived in the ritzy part of Montreal. So
the English-speaking part, you mean?
Yes.
Okay.
This little English-speaking enclave.
Wow. Okay, and then let's see. Okay, they keep on going about JF. Oh, 20-8. Okay, they're calling out that's why I got confused. You said 20-8, meaning 8 to 20 years, and I misunderstood you because we wouldn't say it that way. It's a different, different way of, we'd say 8 to 20 years. 20-8. Okay, interesting. Learned something new. And then I think that mostly covers it. I'm just seeing, is there anything else? Yeah, okay. They're really going on about JF. Okay. The Acadians got forced out at gunpoint by redcoats, Truck Bro says.
Yeah, this is a whole... So...
It's Cajun week here at...
Anyway. Yeah. There's a whole history here that I'm not that familiar with.
Okay.
About the... So...
Well, and I mean, just to state the obvious, they left Canadian history at this point, right? I mean, and that was hundreds of years ago. So they left Canada.
They left Canadian history at that point.
They became part of our story here in America, in New Orleans, and we all know about them. But we don't. Yeah. We just know that they came from Canada at some point, but most of us wouldn't know what exactly went down. And it sounds like you guys have kind of forgotten.
Well, so it's political, the extent to which land for the Loyalists in what was then Acadia was confiscated from French Canadians. So
got it.
It's like if you say, did certain people get 40 acres and a mule? Well, you're going to get different answers.
Right, exactly. Now this is now wait a second. This is interesting. I don't know if I'm putting this together wrong, but Romantic Innkeeper of Grand Soren says, who ended up funding the FLQ. I think he's saying the Cajuns were funders for the FLQ.
So the question of funding for the FLQ is not... did we just lose the stream?
Oh, what? No.
Either we lost the stream or I lost my... Okay, fine. I lost my internet connection for a half a second.
Okay, I hear you, so I think we're good.
Yeah, so the question of funding for the FLQ is not one that has a kind of well-publicized answer. Remember that the FLQ is dissolved in a negotiation, not dissolved in like a hard crackdown with a big public inquiry. So a lot of the details of how this network operated are not public knowledge. So we don't actually know where the money for all of this stuff came from. As far as I understand, there wasn't actually all that much money involved.
Oh, sorry. The commenter clarified. I was just asking who ended up funding the FLQ. No implication it was the Acadians. Okay, my mistake there.
Yeah.
He just wondered if we knew who funded them, and you're saying we kind of don't, basically, right?
We kind of don't.
Yeah.
We kind of don't. but it's also like they're a low budget terrorist organization. They're not a high budget terrorist
Oh yeah, and
organization.
that's what we saw in Days of Rage. They often were funded by these left-wing terror groups in the U.S. were funded by robberies. No one was
Yeah.
funding them. They were self-funding in the sense that they went out and stole and then funded themselves that way. So yeah, I think of all the groups we looked at, only the Weather Underground seemed to be basically drawing on rich patrons, rich left-wing patrons, and were kind of living. Some of the leadership was living it up, while others were running around underground, and well, they were all underground, but some were living hand to mouth and getting pretty resentful that the leadership was hanging out at some nice place in California that a left-wing patron was letting them stay in, you know. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, in general, this is a story of left-wing radicals who are uh, not there because some foreign power is funding them or anything, as far as I can tell.
Well, I mean, at this stage, there was no USAID, so
Yes, right. Okay, excellent. I thank you very much, Black Horse, to cover this. And it really wraps up something that had bothered me that I knew I skipped over. The other thing I skipped over in Days of Rage was, I think, a whole chapter I skipped having to do with Puerto Rican independence, a Puerto Rican independence outfit that didn't they try to assassinate a president or something? Anyway, they did some pretty serious stuff in trying to further their end of having Puerto Rico be an independent state instead of what it is now, which is some kind of territory of the U.S., something like that.
yeah.
And I was less interested in digging into that than into the FLQ, which is a bit closer to home.
Yeah.
I mean, what's Montreal? What is Montreal closest to in the U.S.? Like city
Well,
that it would be near.
yeah. I mean, it's immediately north of, like, if you go north, if you could drive straight north of New York City, it would be north of New York City.
Okay, that's what I was going to say. It's kind of near New York City. Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway, not that far. Yeah, and as you hinted at in your essay, which we've shared a link in the live chat and also on Twitter, underneath the stream on Twitter. Please check it out. This is the beginning of a new project for Black Horse and his friends there at the Red Ensign. As you pointed out, certain things are going on right now that kind of make you wonder if the chance for Quebec independence is still an open path, right?
Yeah, I mean, the Parti Québécois has promised to bring a new referendum if they're elected, and it looks like they're going to be.
Okay.
So
yeah, and they actually had one and lost. And how did that
so
happen?
they had a referendum in 1994.
Right.
So in 1994, they were in power in provincial politics. At that time, the federal government was in effective bankruptcy, and the Parti Québécois brought forward the issue, and the referendum that they offered, they were able to establish a framework with the federal government for how to do a referendum on separation, and they brought forward the question: do the people of Quebec authorize the government of Quebec to negotiate a separation agreement? And there was a lot of unclarity as to whether. So at the time, the thinking was there'd be one referendum to negotiate, a second referendum to exit,
Mm-hmm.
and they lost the first referendum extremely narrowly, I think by like 3%.
Yeah, but I guess I'm surprised because yeah, someone in the chat asked, do they actually want independence though?
Well, so French Canada has been divided on the issue of independence for quite a long time.
Why is that?
I mean, why is Texas divided on the issue of independence?
Well,
Right.
yeah, but
So,
most Texans would see themselves as Americans. Do the French Canadians really think of themselves as just part of Canada?
well, they think of themselves. The phrase they use is a nation within a nation.
Mm-hmm.
So there's this long-standing kind of view that being part of Canada offers benefits to Quebec. Um, and one of the things that's happened since 1994 is a lot of those benefits have been tarnished. So, like, one of the big benefits of being that one of the big things that was brought forward at the time is that being part of Canada gave Quebec free trade access to the United States, um, something that they might not be able to get on their own.
Mm,
Selling hydroelectric power into New York State is a huge part of the Quebec economy. Uh, Basically, the argument that was made in 1994 is if you separate, you will be poorer. Um,
got it. Okay.
and that argument had less salience in 94 than it did at other times in Quebec history, which is why the referendum came up then. Um,
Okay.
and it has a lot less salience now than it has at other times in Canadian history, which is why the issue of the referendum is coming up again.
Gotcha. Yeah,
Um,
Truck Bro says there's no interest in separation in Quebec. Currently, the question is a social conservative socialism in a federalist framework, or a socially progressive socialism in a federalist framework.
yeah, I mean the counter argument here is Quebec is very aggressive about trying to have its own immigration laws. Um, and those have worked very well at keeping direct immigrants out of Quebec, especially non-French speaking direct immigrants, but they have not worked well. There is increasing anxiety in Quebec about the resettlement of recent migrants, uh, not landing in Quebec, but arriving in Quebec via somewhere else.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so there's been a whole series of laws to try to discourage this, things like hijab bans and uh, various kinds of attempts to enforce uh, French Canadian the French Canadian ethnic identity under the guise of the French Canadian linguistic identity. Um,
So you're not joking
and
when you talk about them as ethno-nationalists. It sounds like the things that I see, European and American ethno-nationalists advocating, they actually do. They actually make laws in Quebec of these
yes,
fantasies,
yeah.
right? They actually do them.
Well, a good example is in Quebec, it is illegal to have your store sign in a language other than French, and
Right.
they have specialized language police that will go around and make sure your sign is in French. Make sure you greet a customer first in French. You can speak
Mm-hmm.
to them in another language afterwards, but you must greet them in
Right.
French.
Wow.
And there's a whole series of these things. Um, and the Truck Bro talks about separatism. Se- there's tremendous support in French Canada for uh, ethno nationalism under the guise of linguistic nationalism. Actual separatism is um, a much more divided kind of question.
Okay. Well,
Um,
okay. Well, this sounds relatively sane, I have to say, given their goals. That is, they seem to be quite united on remaining distinct and doing
yes,
and using their provincial authority to remain distinct. And they pass laws that would shock Western liberals, right? Uh, um, um, while at the same time viewing actually being, de jure a separate nation as a pragmatic decision. Does this benefit us or does it not? And there's pros and cons, and they discuss those and they go back and forth depending on how tariffs are
yeah,
going with the US or whatever, right?
yeah, and generally the tone facing Anglo Canada shifts over time. So, like, when I began my career working, well, when I first went down to work in Montreal in the early 2000s, uh, it was quite a welcoming place to Anglo Canadian business. Uh, Separatist sentiments were very calm. You were treated quite well as an Anglo Canadian. Right at the moment, it's there's a much greater degree of frustration, and they're much, much more socially anti-Anglo, probably anti-other thing as well, but anti-Anglo at the moment. And
Mm-hmm.
these things ebb and flow depending on the politics of the country at the particular time. But they view themselves as having a very large fraction of sovereignty already, and
Right.
it's really just these like they regularly ignore dictates from the Supreme Court of Canada.
Hmm.
So it's de jure separation is the kind of thing they would do. Um, it's the kind of thing they would do if they have to do, right? That's the way it's
Yeah.
thought about.
Right. 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 Gotcha. Okay. So there's every possibility that the two referendums, or however they structure it, could actually pass someday, but it would really depend on the timing and sort of what was going on at the time, um, what they perceived the consequences would be of fully going independent. Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So they're not sort of like ideologically attached to being a separate nation. It is, there's pragmatic considerations that come, calculations that come into it, for sure.
Well, and
Um,
this is actually goes back to the point that was made earlier when the distinction was drawn between the way that the FLQ thought about separation and the way that the Parti Québécois thought about
mm,
representing the French Canadian nation, right?
mhm.
The FLQ were ideologically uh, had an ideological commitment to the idea of a distinct country on a map, right?
Gotcha.
Uh, Whereas the Parti Québécois has an ideological commitment to the furtherance of the French Canadian people.
Right. Yeah. So they're more political, you might say, in the sort of the positive sense of that term. Right.
Yeah,
That
yeah,
that is, how do we reward our friends and punish our enemies? Does
yeah,
this help us
exactly.
reward our friends or punish our enemies, or does it not? Right. Whereas the FLQ is like, no, we just ideologically committed to having a workers' Quebec or whatever, you know.
Yeah, remaking Quebec as an independent Cuban state, right?
Yeah, right, right. Okay, final comment from Frog Bro on that issue of um, how the Quebec does things that would shock Western liberals throughout Europe and the Anglosphere. He says, yes, we do think this way, and we get so frustrated with our Anglo counterparts because they have forgotten themselves and get annoyed with us for not forgetting ourselves. Oof.
Yeah,
I felt that. All right, fair enough, truck bro. We hear you. Okay, good for you guys. Bully for you, as my grandma would say.
there you go.
Okay, I think we've wrapped it up. Let me just make sure I'm not missing a subscribe star thing. I don't think so. Oh, Sam153. What do you think of the Just Watch Me interview by Trudeau Sr.? I always felt it as fake bravado. Oh yeah, so I don't think we mentioned that. There's a phrase he said when it came to this uh, uh, emergency act, or what, I'm sorry, war powers act or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And it became sort of a famous catchphrase for him. So yeah, comments on that?
Yeah. So this is part of a spontaneous exchange with a journalist in front of the Parliament buildings. Um, if you watch the longer exchange, it's the kind of thing you would never see with a politician today. It is an organic, sophisticated conversation about the legitimacy of putting soldiers on every street corner in Canada at the time. And
Hmm.
the reporter asks him, he makes the point that we have to have order. Order is the foundation of everything else. And the reporter says, "Well, how far are you prepared to go with that? Or how far are you prepared to go with the implicit violence that underlies the state?" And his response is, "Well, just watch me."
Hmm.
And this is a phrase that ends the first part of his political career because he's perceived as out of touch with the kind of uh, he is perceived as out of touch with the kind of liberal priors that underlie the country at that time.
Ah.
Um,
So it
so
actually, at least in the short term, it actually works against him.
yes, it sinks his political career for several years. It ends. He gets voted out of office, and then he returns. Uh, I think it's either 4 or 8 years later, and wins another election. So it's a complicated kind of thing, but
Hmm.
the handling of the FLQ crisis actually, and especially the way that comment gets remembered in Canadian media damages his political career catastrophically. Another like eerie parallel to his younger son,
Mm-hmm.
who sees his exodus from Canadian politics in much the same light and expects to return.
Okay. Oh, okay. Yeah. Foreshadowing. Truck Bro says it was fake. The reporter was a personal friend and admitted later it was staged.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, as I say, this is a kind of exchange that you would never see in politics now.
Mm-hmm.
But he, it, if you watch the exchange, it looks like an off the cuff remark, right? And
Yeah.
it plays really, really badly in English Canada.
Okay. Got it. They didn't want the tough guy.
Well, at that point in English Canada, nobody wanted to admit that the state was underpinned by violence, right? This is
Mm,
a big violation of the way that I mean, everybody believes in the social contract at this point, right?
mm-hmm.
It, nobody wants to conceptualize themselves as being underlined at the point of a gun, and uh, whatever whatever drove Trudeau to think that that was a good idea, it was not a good idea for him politically at the time.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Thanks very much to very faithful supporter Sam153 for sending that in on Subscribestar. Okay. We will stop for now. And last week I did I guess I should mention that if you missed it, I did a rather short show on a little bit loose talking about the U.S. empire versus Americans, giving sort of my case against the U.S. empire from the perspective of the well-being of the American people. Um, the meat of it is in like 30 minutes. The whole thing's like, I think 48, and the meat of it's in 30 minutes. So please catch that if you haven't. I think the U.S. empire is not gone. It's just working on what its next phase is going to be. So that's part of the reason I thought it was time to refresh that thought. And then I don't know what I'm going to do next week. Kind of between various series and things I've been working on. So we'll see. Okay, thanks, and see everybody next week, and hopefully with Black Horse in 2 weeks. And make sure to subscribe to the Red Ensign. See the link. In fact, I'll add that to the video description to your essay.
Yeah.
And audio. He's got both an audio and a written form of his Elite Theory Primer on Canadian History. Highly recommended, especially if, like me, you're an ignorant American who should know a lot more about what's north of us and doesn't. But I know more now, thanks to Black Horse. So thanks very much for that. Okay, talk to you guys next time. Bye.
So there's a lot of pro-Confederation French Canadian